The NBA, as we know it today, is a pretty stable business. With 30 franchises, the league is actively trying to make a push to get to 32 as soon as possible. But it wasn't always this way. The BAA, the NBA's predecessor, had 11 teams in its original season. While it has grown, it lost a lot of franchises along the way. In fact, only 3 founding franchises exist today. There is a lot of history here, with some very good teams having their stories lost to time, including one of the league's original champions. Today, we will tell these stories as we dig through the basketball graveyard. There are 23 teams that we will cover today, but before we dive all the way in, I want to get ahead of the ABA problem. This is something that will always be a problem when talking about pre-1970s basketball. The NBA does not officially include ABA stats in their record book. This was a part of the merger. This includes the 8 ABA franchises who folded before or because of the merger directly. I will cover these teams today in an effort to give as much of a complete story as possible. There are some other league names that you're going to hear me say, such as the NPBL and the NBL. These leagues I will not cover in depth, because quite honestly, I couldn't find enough information on them, and we're getting into where it's hard to tell if this was a semi-pro league or a true professional league here in America. So some of these franchises bounce between these leagues, or they were part of the very earliest mergers. It's hard for me to tell, again, which level of professionalism these leagues were, because this career path wasn't as prestigious in 1930 as it is in 2030. I also want to shout out NBAHoopsOnline.com, which is where I was able to find the vast majority of information we will cover today, especially for the very early NBA teams, as well as Basketball Reference, which is the GOAT and the backbone of most NBA content creation. There's also a few other websites that I leaned on pretty heavily, and I will shout them out as we get to that as well. So without further ado, let's begin our journey through the basketball graveyard. The very first BAA season in 1946-47 is where we find our first set of graves. We will start in Detroit, where the Falcons landed for the season after originally planning on heading to Indianapolis. Once they ultimately decided to go to Detroit, they played in an arena named the Detroit Olympia. The Falcons were the first and only team in the BAA to have some pressure attached to their success, as they were in direct competition for the Detroit market, as the NBL's Detroit Gems were in town. This team would eventually become the modern day Lakers, by the way. So there was some extra pressure to defend this market and keep the BAA's control in the city. The Falcons were headlined by Sizzlin' Stan Misek, John Janisic, and Ariel Magan. This team was not good. Coach Glenn Curtis was canned after a 12-22 start and was replaced by Philip Sachs, who closed out the year going 8-18. The Falcons finished with a 20-40 record overall, and although with an average margin of victory of -2, which doesn't sound horrible, that was 8th in the 11-team league. However, they sucked at the main goal of basketball, putting the ball in the hoop. They were dead last in field goal percentage, shooting 24.6% as a team. Like I mentioned in my history scoring video, and I will continue to mention in future videos talking about the early days of basketball, this is the absolute dark ages of the sport. Shooting percentages are comparable to modern day 4th grade basketball. Still, 24.6% from adults is insane, regardless of era. The Falcons finished 4th in the Western Division, missing the playoffs, and quietly folding as a franchise. The NBA would not return to Detroit until the Fort Wayne Pistons would relocate to the city in 1957. Only Misak, Janich, Magan, and Grady Lewis would continue their careers beyond the season. This is the first of 4 franchises to fold after the inaugural BAA season. The Pittsburgh Ironmen also only survived just the inaugural season of the BAA and were much worse than the Falcons, sometimes considered the worst basketball team ever. This team does have some notable players, but for off-the-court reasons. Peter Press Maravich, father of LSU superstar and Utah Jazz guard Pete Maravich, played his only pro season for the Ironmen. Pittsburgh is also considered the first NBA team to have brothers playing together, with Noble and Roger Jorgensen taking the court together. The Ironmen were coached by Paulie Burge, who marched his troops to battle and ended with a 15-45 record. Yikes. This squad only had 4 double-digit wins, but had 24 double-digit losses. I was not exaggerating when I said this may be the worst team ever. My favorite part about all this, they beat their expected win-loss of 12-48. Now I have no clue how they calculate expected win-loss for 1940s basketball, but I don't care. They suck if that was the expectation. It probably doesn't help that their head coach was a crash out who threw chairs at players, almost hurt Maravich, and fought fans, including almost starting a riot in St. Louis. Believe it or not, this guy actually got another job in the NBA, coaching for the Fort Wayne Pistons, where he had a winning record in 3 years before ultimately getting banned. This is an absolute bonkers season in the Steel City, and the NBA has never been back since. The Toronto Huskies may be one of the most famous franchises we'll talk about, and maybe the most famous one-season franchise ever, due to the Toronto Raptors having multiple iterations of Huskies throwback uniforms. The Huskies are also forever baked into NBA history, as their season-opening loss to the New York Knicks was the first NBA game ever. I do think it is quite funny that a major American league had its first game in Canada. Granted, James Naismith is Canadian, so it probably is better this way, but still. As for that game itself, Ed Sadowski led all scorers with 18, and of course fouled out. Sadowski also coached this game as he started the season as a player, coach, GM. He would go 3-9 in this role before demanding a trade, wanting to play for a winning team. I'd argue he'd played the biggest role possible in that 3-9 start, as he was, again, the coach, the GM who made the roster, and the star player averaging nearly 20 points per game. But ownership traded him nonetheless. This insanity led to more insanity, as the new GM, Lou Heyman, stepped into now the GM and coaching role to coach game number 13, where the Providence Steamrollers, steamrolled the Huskies. After the game, Dick Fitzgerald took on the role of player coach for 3 games, going 2-1, before Robert Rolfe would bring stability to the bench, coaching the rest of the season, finishing 17-27 as head coach. That does mean that yes, a 2-1 Dick Fitzgerald is the only Husky head coach to have a winning record. Maybe they should have let him finish the year out. Anyways, I know that was a lot of different people with a lot of math and a lot of losses. The Huskies went 22-38 overall and finished dead last in the Eastern Division. The Huskies also lost $100,000 in one season, probably because they had so many coaches and no one showed up at the games. They would fold after just the one season. As we make our way through the graveyard, one trend that appears early is that, well, these teams sucked. While it is usually true, it wasn't always. Let me introduce you to the Cleveland Rebels, the only team to have a franchise all-time win percentage at exactly 500. And from a strictly basketball standpoint, this team shouldn't have folded. 9 players on the squad, played in the NBA after the inaugural season, including 2 future champions, and hey, there's Ed again, 2 all-BAA players. And while sure, they fired their head coach 2/3 of the way through the season, they were still good, and like I mentioned, finished with a 30-30 record. They even were making history off the court, as owner Al Supfin hired his daughter in the front office, making her, more than likely, the first woman to work in basketball. So why did the team fold after just 1 year? Money. There are differing reports on how much money Cleveland lost, but the fact of the matter is they were in the red. It doesn't help that even while the team had a winning record down the stretch and were in the hunt for a playoff spot, the Rebels set the record for the lowest attended NBA game ever, with an official count of 182 people in attendance at Cleveland Arena, 72-64 win over the Boston Celtics. This would be their last win of the regular season. The Rebels made the playoffs and took on the New York Knicks. They won Game 1 by 26 at home, the very last home game ever. Games 2 and 3 on the road were not competitive, and the Rebels would fold after just one season. Unfortunately, bad ownership in Cleveland does not end with Mr. Supfin. Just ask Cavs fans. As we move forward just 2 seasons, we see the next set of graves. In this time, the BAA has dropped from 11 teams to 7, then would get to 8, and then 12 in the 1948-49 season, which is where we'll meet our next franchise, the Indianapolis Jets. Now, the Jets had already existed in a different league before joining the BAA, playing the vast majority of their history as the Indianapolis Huskies. They had to change their name to the Jets when entering the BAA because of a very strict anti-corporation naming rule, which was common practice to do in other leagues. Because owner Frank Koski owned a grocery store line, it was considered a corporate sponsor. In its season in the BAA, 25 players suited up for the Jets, an unreal number. They played their games in the now famous Hinkle Fieldhouse. The team was not good at any point, as player coach Bruce Hale had the Jets at 4-13 before being removed as coach and being traded to Fort Wayne. Burl Friddle, by the way, what a name, finished out the season as coach and went 14-29 as head coach. Overall, the Jets went 18-42, finishing dead last in the West. Now, financially, the Jets were fine after the season. I mean, I would hope so after nearly 20 years of existence, right? However, with the BAA merging with the NBL to become the NBA, the Indianapolis Olympians were added to the league, and, well, Indy just wasn't big enough for 2 teams. The Jets opted to cease operations. Don't worry, we'll get to see the Olympians down the road. The end of the 1948-49 season also marked the end of the road for the Providence Steamrollers, who were the first team to make it past year 1 and still end up folding. They were one of the founding 11 teams, yet were unable to stay afloat. they will not be the last to face this fate. The Steamrollers were never all that great. In fact, they are another franchise that can be considered one of the worst. They never made the playoffs, nor had a winning record. Robert Morris, who was replaced after the inaugural season, had the best coaching record at 28-32. This was the best they got in Providence. The franchise has some interesting history in the NBA, as they played the Knicks in the first Christmas game, losing 89-75 during their 6-42 campaign. In the next season, and their last, the Steamrollers played a game with the oldest player to ever play in a game, that being Nat Hickey at 46. That, as of 2026, is still the record, but LeBron might have the wheels to knock this one off. Hickey had also been the team's coach the year prior during that horrific 6-42 season. Those 6 wins are still the least amount won by an NBA team in any season, and is only 19 one-thousandths of a win percentage better than the 7-59 2012 Charlotte Bobcats, who have the worst win percentage ever. After the 1949 season, owner Lou Perry folded the team, but that isn't the end of the story quite yet. A man named Robert Shevnov bought the franchise rights from Perry's estate after he passed. Shevnov tried to sue the NBA before the 1980 draft to reinstate the Steamrollers. The way the bylaws were written gave Providence like a sliver of hope, but the NBA and their lawyers disagreed, and a federal judge eventually sided with the league. The Steamrollers were not brought back from the dead. As we continue through the graveyard, we see a set of 6 graves from the 1950 season. Of the 6 franchises, 4 of them only lasted 1 season in the NBA. I want to talk about these 4 first because they are the only 4 teams to ever gain NBA membership, then jump ship afterwards. Those teams are the Anderson Packers, the original Denver Nuggets, the Sheboygan Redskins, and the Waterloo Hawks. Essentially, these 4 teams were forced out altogether because the big markets didn't want to travel there, and well, there isn't a lot of fans in the market of, say, Waterloo, Iowa, or Anderson, Indiana. So these 4 team stories are all tied together, but we'll start with the Anderson Packers, who played in 4 different leagues under 3 different names. The Packers are led by Frankie Bryan, who was an 18-point per game scorer and an All-NBA second-team member. Bryan would stay in the NBA after this season, not continuing to play for Anderson after, which was a good call considering he was a 2-time All-Star. Bryan was very good, and so were the Packers, who finished 37-27 and second in the Western Division. Like many other defunct teams we've seen, the Anderson Packers had 3 different coaches in the season, including owner Ike Duffy stepping in to coach 3 games, going 1-2. Side note, the home arena for the Anderson Packers was Anderson High School's gym. Just insanity going on in the 1940s NBA. The Anderson Packers would win 2 series in their only NBA season before losing to the Minneapolis Lakers in the semifinals, which seems like an extra round only the Western and Central divisions had to go through. Just an overall weird season if you couldn't tell. After this season, the Anderson Packers left the NBA, playing 1 season in the MPBL. On the complete other side of success was the 1950 Denver Nuggets. Now, this Denver Nuggets is not a part of the history of the current franchise, and instead their legacy is frozen in time. I honestly think that's better because that locks in the most unique franchise timeline possible. The Denver Nuggets, the original Denver Nuggets, began as an AAU team all the way back in 1935 called the Denver Safeway Piggly Wigglies. Yes, I'm being so serious. They laid claim to 3 AAU titles in 1937, 39, and 42. 3 AAU titles is still more championships than my Timberwolves have. So hey, good for them. Anyways, the amateur team turned pro in the 1945-46 season in the ABL as the Denver Amber Rose Jellymakers before simplifying to the Denver Nuggets. Jimmy Darden was the player coach for the Nuggets throughout the whole season, though seemingly decided to DMP himself for the majority of the season, even though he was scoring 9 points a game. Maybe he got hurt, but there's no way for me to know for sure 70 years removed. They started the season 0-15 and never recovered. They would finish the season 11-51 before being a part of the NPBL ship, playing there for a season and making it 1 more year in the ABL before shutting their doors. The first NBA team in Wisconsin didn't play in Milwaukee, Madison, or any of the other larger cities. No, they played in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, as the Sheboygan Redskins. I think any of the names they use as an indie team would have been a better choice. My favorite personally being the Ballhorns, but alas, they went with arguably the worst team name in NBA history. Everything about the team screamed unserious, from the team names to the city size to even the 3,500 seat armory they used as their home arena. But they were a decently placed middle ground between Chicago and Milwaukee, so Sheboygan did have a chance to pull from both markets. Sheboygan did have some success in other leagues, being an NBL champion in 1943 and winning the 1951 championship in the MPBL that all 4 of these teams joined. But in the NBA, under the command of Ken Sussens, the team finished with a record of 22-40, which somehow did make them eligible for the NBA playoffs. Looking at the game chart, good God did they not like to play close games, and they lost big a lot. Noble Jorgensen, who we talked about in Pittsburgh, led the team in scoring at 13 a game. Given the era, 82.4 points per game and 34.4% from the field doesn't sound horrible, but I guess they just didn't believe in playing defense. In the 1950 playoffs, Sheboygan took on the Indianapolis Olympians. They lost game 1 by just a point, got a solid 10-point win in their last home game in the NBA, and lost game 3 by 7, ending their time in the NBA. As I mentioned before, Sheboygan won the MPBL championship in the next year before playing one more year as an independent club. Their final game before folding was a loss to the 1952 College All-Stars. The Waterloo Hawks represent the entire history of my birth state's representation in the Big Four sports leagues. They also played in an arena called the Hippodrome, which I thought was an awesome name and still kind of do. And I thought it had something to do with hippos, but no, it's just like a standard venue naming type. Kind of ruined my fun there, but whatever. Here's something fun to make up for it. Their owner's name was Pinky George. So now to get into the basketball, the Hawks only existed for 3 years, playing one in the NBL as just a sub 500 team, their 1 year in the NBA, and then a really good year in the NPBL before folding. In the NBA, success was something that did not occur often in Waterloo. Under the leadership of player coach Charlie Shipp, the team started 8-27. Like many of the other teams we mentioned, they relieved the player coach of his duties and then went and hired a real coach. Wait, no. They went and acquired Jack Smiley from the Anderson Packers in a deal I couldn't track down the details to, but then named him player coach. Smiley was a little better at it, going 11-16 down the stretch to end the miserable season 19-43. Again, this was a team that was allergic to close games either way as well. Waterloo finished 5th in the Western Division and was not invited to play in the playoffs, meaning their time in the NBA was over. We now move to one of the most successful teams that we will cover today, the Chicago Stags. The Stags never had a losing record, made the 1947 finals, and had stable coaching. Harold Olson and Philip Brownstein had one of the more underrated players in Max Savlosky, and oh, by the way, was in one of America's biggest markets in Chicago. So what the hell happened? Well, Abe Saperstein, owner of the Harlem Globetrotters, bought the Stags for $40,000 after the 1950 season and changed the name to the Chicago Bruins. But come September, he pulled out of the deal and demanded $20,000 from the NBA. NBA president Maurice Podloff said no. Then it is said that Podloff folded the team due to the franchise's inability to repay the $40,000 loan that helped them get through the season. So regardless of how good the on-court product was, the team was broke and finds themselves in the graveyard. The St. Louis Bombers were the 6th and final team to fold in the 1949-50 season. Again, this was a team that was pretty successful, finishing their overall existence above 500. They also had 2 coaches over their 4 years, including no in-season changes. They never hit the highs that Chicago did, but they were still pretty good. There were 2 main reasons why St. Louis failed in the late 40s. At the time, the city itself had some internal struggles and aligned culturally with southern states, which in the era we are talking about, being the pre-civil rights movement, this caused some issues. Some players did not want to play for St. Louis because of these cultural differences. And on top of this, attendance was low, and the 1950 season was the team's worst in its short history. These all combined in the team deciding to fold after the 1950 season. The Washington Capitals are the next grave that we'll visit, another founding BAA team that no longer exists. The Caps were, like the last 2 teams we have covered, above 500 and actually had more seasons where they won their division than they had seasons with a losing record. They even gave Hall of Fame coach Red Auerbach his start in the league before he went on to shape the Boston Celtics into his vision for the next 30 or so years. They also held multiple win streak records, including one that stood all the way until the 2015-2016 Warriors beating it, that being that they opened their 1948-49 season with 15 straight wins. For a very long time, that looked like one of those sports records that would never be beaten. They are also credited with breaking the race barrier, as Earl Lloyd was one of 3 black players to play in the 1950 NBA season. So there's all kinds of good things happening for Washington, yet we stand here at their grave. What happened? If you haven't caught on yet, it always comes back to money. In the 1950-51 season, Auerbach had already moved on, and the team was now headed by player coach Bones McKinney, who actually leaned more on the coach side of his role, only playing 10 games for Washington that season. The Caps, very early into the season, realized that this was not going to be one of their better teams, so they began to try and cut costs to try and survive, selling rights to some of their starters and replacing them with cheaper versions, such as swapping out Dan Otten, a 9-6 guy, for Ed McCann, a 4-2 guy from Rochester. This led to a bad team getting worse, turning away any remaining interested fans, which then made the money problem worse. This snowball effect led to yet another historically good franchise folding after just one bad season. This next team caused the death of a prior franchise and yet couldn't even survive long-term themselves. As we head into the 1953 offseason, we see the grave of the Indianapolis Olympians. The Olympians were just sub 500 in their history, and beyond their first season existence, they were just okay. One of the key reasons for this was the suspension and expulsion from the NBA of their two stars, Alex Grossa and Ralph Beard. These two were arrested in connection to a point-shaving scandal in their collegiate days at Kentucky. Now, an interesting fact that comes with this was the fact that the Olympians were owned by the players on the team, a first ever, and the only example I can find today or at any point in history is Leo Messi currently owning a part of Inter Miami today. Even then, he doesn't completely own it like these guys did. My point here is that NBA money wasn't that crazy in 1950, and I can see why that may have raised some eyebrows at the time and may have given a reason to investigate these guys. To buy a franchise as a player means they had a lot more money than they probably should have. That was a huge reason for their collapse on the court, but before we get into why they completely folded, I want to look at some interesting history this team is a part of. First, the Olympians were a part of the first neutral site game against the Syracuse Nationals in Louisville. The Olympians are also the only team to play a game with just 5 players, which is now illegal by the rulebook. See, the Olympians had a back-to-back scheduled in January of 1951 that included a road game in Rochester, then a quick train ride to Chicago for the next game. A bit of a hike, especially in 1951, but whatever. They should be able to handle this as pros. The problem came when the Rochester game went to a 6th overtime and the Olympians won 75-76. You cannot tell me this was a good basketball game, by the way. 2 overtimes are scoreless. I'm sorry, that's just not good basketball. But because of how late into the night this game went, Indy missed the last train going to Chicago. They were able to get a charter flight, but the plane could only fit 5. So they shipped their starters to Chicago to face the Tri-City Blackhawks, where they lost 79-83. Honestly, all things considered, that's not a bad outcome with just 5 players. All right, now they've had some fun with their history, let's get back to why they folded. And it all comes back to that point-shaving scandal. Because Grossa and Beard were forced to sell at a loss, that meant that there was much less money coming back into the organization. The cheaper the price, of course, means that you don't have to be as rich to buy in. Now, I cannot track down who bought Grossa and Beard shares, if it was another player or an outside party, and that may have played a role on top of all of this, but the new financial burdens were too much, and it caused the team to fold. The final NBA grave that we have is the one that gave birth to this video. This grave belongs to the original Baltimore Bullets, who existed 8 seasons, from the 1947-48 season to the 1954-55 season. While they have a near 1/3 winning percentage and only 3 playoff appearances in those 8 years, they also have something that no other team we covered has: an NBA championship. The 1947-48 season marked the first in the NBA for the Baltimore Bullets, and they immediately dominated the 8-team league, finishing 1 game out from the best record in the league at 28-20, led by player coach Buddy Jeanette, who was also one of the team's best players in terms of win shares. The Bullets defeated the Joe Fulks Philadelphia Warriors in 6 games to win the BAA title in year 1. Today, this is the only NBA championship not owned by one of the 30 modern-day franchises. This title is frozen in time, never to be claimed by anyone. After 6 more seasons of varying success, we head to the 1954-55 season, where the Baltimore Bullets headed into the season with back-to-back 16-win seasons. The team would get off to a blazing hot 2-9 start before firing coach Claire B, giving assistant head coach Albert Barthelm the nod for the rest of the season. He would only end up coaching 3 games. The final game was a 92-89 loss to the Fort Wayne Pistons on the road, where center Bob Hubriggs led all scorers with 30 points. And while that did catch my eye, what really stunned me was the dominance of the rookie #1 overall pick, Frank Selby. Selby averaged 20.3 points per game in these 14 games, but is only credited with 11 games officially, as none of these games are officially recognized by the NBA. I was able to track them down thanks to the work of APBR, and because of the NBA not recognizing these games, there's actually a good chunk of stats missing from the season across the board. For Frank, this was the best it got for him in the NBA, as he never matched this level of scoring again, although he did carve out a 9-year career. Selvey may have been a guy for Baltimore, but they just couldn't make it through the season to find out, marking the last NBA team to fold. Now we head into the ABA, jumping all the way to the 1970s. The Pittsburgh Condors and the Floridians are the first Graves we see, both from the 1972 offseason. We see a champion in the Condors, who won as the Pipers led by MVP Connie Hawkins in their first season. Then chaos broke out, with the team coming to Minnesota for a season, shout out, and having 4 different coaches in the singular season. This prompted Hawkins to leave for the NBA, which was a well-established league at this point. The Pipers returned to Pittsburgh and rebranded the Condors, but the fans felt alienated and never returned to watch the team. They also kind of sucked, and these two combined led to the Condors folding in 1972. The Floridians also had a stint in Minnesota, shout out, as the Muskies before giving all their players a climate shock and moving them to Miami. Like the Condors, their first season was the best, although it didn't bring any hardware with it. Jim Pollard, an eventual Hall of Famer, gave them stability at the bench, but after being fired in the 1969 season after a 5-15 start, the Floridians were never the same and folded in 1972 after not being able to secure a solid relocation city, as the Florida fans were not all that interested in basketball at the time. The Memphis Sounds are the last of the pre-merger Graves that we see. They folded 1 year before the merger became official, playing their final season under the Memphis Sounds name, previously known as the Tams, Pros, and Buccaneers while they played in New Orleans. Once again, year 1 was the best, with the then Buccaneers going 48-30 and making the finals. They were actually very good under Babe McCarthy, who won 40-plus games in each of the first 4 years. He was fired after a 26-58 season, opening up a coaching carousel in Memphis, as no one was able to get the franchise back above 500. With just 1 season under their name, the Sounds folded due to, of course, money. This brings us to our last 5 franchises to go defunct, all in the 1975 season or in the 1976 summer after the merger became official. These teams were the San Diego Sails, the Kentucky Cardinals, the Spirits of St. Louis, the Utah Stars, and the Virginia Squires. San Diego made it just 3 weeks into the 1975 season before folding. Utah would make it to December before joining them due to missing payroll. Virginia was a shell of themselves financially and were on the way out, but made it through the season. Unlike the NBA, the ABA did continue to officially track stats for these teams, so we can see the chaos that was the final ABA season in 1975-76. Only 6 teams would have made it to a 1976-77 season, those being the 4 teams the NBA would be taking, the Nuggets, Spurs, Pacers, and Nets, and 2 teams whose futures were now very uncertain, the Spirits of St. Louis and the Kentucky Cardinals. Now, the Colonels made sense to add. They had very strong attendance numbers and were very competitive. But the NBA was adamant on only bringing 4 teams. Perfect. Kentucky finished 4th. Take the top 4. Except Chicago really wanted Artis Gilmore, who they had the NBA rights to and was the star player for Kentucky. If Kentucky was added to the NBA, he would stay with the team, or best case for Chicago, likely would have to enter into a legal battle over which league's rights trumped the others. It was cleaner for Kentucky to just take their place in the grave. That leaves St. Louis, whose owners Ozzie and Daniel Silna wanted above anything else to own a basketball team. When they saw Utah miss payroll, they offered to merge mid-season with the Utah Stars to keep both franchises afloat as one and probably make them a pretty good combined team. That never came to be, and after the season, they had plans to move the Spirits to Utah anyways. They also had a plan to sell the Spirits and buy the Colonels and move them to Buffalo to replace the Braves who were moving in the NBA. That wouldn't happen either. These guys simply wanted to find a way to be included in the merger. Whether for the money or for the love of the game is up to you. They eventually settled for the money, and a lot of it. The final deal as part of the merger killed the Spirits of St. Louis, but the Silna brothers got to walk away with $2.2 million that day, as well as a 1/7 of the shares in the San Antonio, Indiana, New York/Brooklyn, and Denver TV markets. This deal made the brothers money all the way into the modern day, where in 2014, a revised version of this deal saw them cash a $500 million check from these 4 teams. Not gonna lie, I would let my basketball team die for less than $500 million, that is for sure. I was unable to find an absolute number. I saw $800 million as one of the numbers thrown out there that these 2 brothers are potentially worth, all because they refused to just allow the Spirits to die like the rest of these franchises. But ultimately, they found their way in the grave. And with the Spirits settling into their grave, they take their place as the final major professional basketball team to fold. And looking at the NBA right now, I'd say this graveyard is full. I don't see any teams folding anytime soon. as there are billions of dollars holding every single one of these franchises up. Being a major sport in America also means something completely different now than it did in the 1970s or earlier. And while there are 30 plus survivors in the league today, with more on the way, let us not forget the history that can be found from those that are no longer with us. Thanks for watching, subscribe if you're new, and I hope you enjoyed.